Welcome to the End of Life Conversations podcast. I'm Reverend Wakil David Matthews.
And I'm the Reverend Mother Ana Luisa Armendariz. In this podcast, we share people's experiences with death and dying, whether it's grief and loss, or joy and celebration, all things related to the end of life.
We so enjoy all our insightful and passionate guests who generously tell their stories with compassion and wisdom. So let's get started.
Welcome. Yay. We are so glad to meet and talk with Neshia Alaovae. Neshia is a Black and Samoan woman, disabled mama, poet, and death worker. She cares deeply about connecting cultural wisdom, ancestral resilience, and BIPOC joy to create new, empowered possibilities for how we live and how we die. Her first experiences of what many refer to as death doula work was in 2012 as a compassionate companion at a residential hospice in Washington, D.C. that serves homeless or housing insecure people dying of AIDS or cancer. Neshia continues to think of herself as a death companion.
Beautiful. Neshia has worked as a diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer for faith organizations, nonprofits, and institutions such as the Washington Department of Health. She is a licensed mental health counselor who spent over a decade serving people navigating trauma, grief, and cultural identity. Currently, she runs A Thoughtful Death, a death care practice offering end-of-life consultation and support for people wanting a more intentional experience with dying. Neshia loves reading, long meals with loved ones, and trying to keep her two toddlers from eating too much dirt. A little is okay.
Mama,
Wow.
I hear you. I see you.
A little's good for the immune system, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just let him have it.
We should all eat a little dirt now and then.
Yeah. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate you showing up and all the work you're doing. We like to start each of our episodes by asking when you first became aware of death.
Sure. I was thinking about this question, and I had the good fortune, like a lot of people do, of being raised by really amazing grandparents who absolutely spoiled me. But I was raised by my maternal grandparents in Samoa, and they were pastors in small villages. And so in their role as faith leaders, they were often the first people who were called when someone became ill, when someone was dying, and they always took me with them. So, my first memory of death really is as a 3-year-old. And I remember that I was 3 because one of my grandfather's best friends was dying. And my grandfather, asked me to sing him a song. And so I remember singing this song about being 3 and, like dancing and singing and just like prancing around my grandfather's friend's deathbed. And,
Wow.
And I remember that he was just like so delighted by it. This is a man that I knew and who I loved. And I remember climbing all over him, bringing him mangoes and singing him my songs and, bringing him soup and watching my grandfather and my grandmother hold his hand and be with their family and talking with them. And so those were my first experiences of death, of watching my elders not be afraid of it.
Beautiful. Wow.
What a gift.
Yeah. That's such a blessing. I think maybe that's a record breaker for the earliest that anybody we've asked that question of.
It's a beautiful piece too, because it's not a pet, right? And what I really appreciate about your story is that there's a weave of the end of life, of death transitioning, and like a child and joy and hope and like present. So that is a really beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and also the cultural aspect of it, which we are always wanting to learn more about. So That's beautiful. I hope, we want to hear more about the cultural stuff because that's so important for us to understand in our little isolated America, a place where we think everything is about the United States,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had never heard of something called, a home funeral. I'd never realized how unusual it is to be with your people all the way through the process.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize really until like a few years ago how many people do not have ritual, do not have customs, do not have traditions around death and grief to be able to turn to, right? Because I feel like so often at time of death, after death, we as humans, if we don't have those things, we feel really lost. We
Yeah.
feel really hopeless and really alone. And so for those of us who come from cultures that still have these really strong and really present, there's a ritual to it, there's a protocol to it, there's this frame that helps hold us. So when our minds leave during the grief, during the shock, during all of those big feelings, right? We know that there's something and there are people holding us,
Yeah.
that we're not going to fall apart, and that there's this way of making it through where we know we could come out the other side, right?
Yeah, that's so important. And I think it's something that all of us are striving for, at least those of us who are thinking about this are always looking for, how do we create those rituals? How do we have to recreate it because we've separated ourselves so much from it. So thank you for that reminder. It's so important.
Well, and I'm gonna land in that ritual piece too. I was thinking about it yesterday. I had the beautiful fortune to spend time with a friend of mine whose mama just passed. And she was relaying the story to me of being in the hospital with her 5 siblings and the caregiver who had spent the last 10 years taking care of her mother who had Alzheimer's. And she's, she's a person who I think would look towards somebody else to do the ritual pieces. But in fact, she was there. The caregiver for her mother said, well, let's wash her now together, And I was like, that is the ritual. And that is the ritual that we do when we have babies. We swaddle them, we clean them. That is the ritual when we have been going through a process that has made us, sweaty and tired and dusty. We bathe, we wash,
Right.
we recollect ourselves. And I just sitting and thinking last night about that. Oh, and because last night I was also reading a book about washing babies who have died. And, the parents of this particular book was talking about how they're too stunned to wash their, stillborn babies or children who have not made it to full gestation. And, the horror that they think they will meet. And yet the gift that is given to them once somebody says, let's wash the baby. And in this book, she says that is the biggest gift, of allowing these people to interact with their little baby when, with their elders, anybody, to just wash them. Because at some really beautiful part, we assimilate the knowledge that they have passed. And it is also a ritual. And we will continue to come back to that moment and the washing. I suddenly, I just keep thinking about washing that I've been thinking for the last 24 hours. So,
yeah, that's beautiful. I wonder how that also applies to other kinds of losses. Loss of a relationship or loss of a job or something like that.
Yeah.
Probably going home and just taking a shower and then getting somebody to swaddle you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Be
Right?
a really beautiful ritual for that.
You need a hug. That's a swaddle, right?
Yeah.
Or you get yourself in your blanket and you just weep and you mourn, but you swaddle yourself. But I was thinking about when, my children were smaller and they'd fall or whatever. They weren't big criers, but we'd always be like, let's wash you, let's wash this. And because of the work that I've learned through, it was always like, put a little water on their head, give them a little heat, right? Just to like, so that the soul loss that they're feeling isn't like big and over the top, but you swaddle them with these pieces of yourself or nature. But we need to think a little bit more. I think, Wakil, you and I will go.
Yeah, I think so. Sounds like another premium episode to me.
Yeah, I love it. And I really believe in the work, Neshia, that, being with those bodies and showing them. And I have to just share this too. This book was saying how they called her a bereavement midwife. And so when she heard that parents weren't ready to meet their babies, she would talk to them at length about what they would see. Like, this is what your baby looks like. And then she's like, I would swaddle the baby, and sometimes I'd leave like the toes sticking out or the, just a little like the pate. But what would it turn out to be was like, that was the invitation, right? That is, like, it's just a small thing. It's not this horror. It's not going to be that way. Sweet baby. And that's how we need to couch death too. Yeah. It's swaddled in this, it's okay. It's like, it's still grandma. It's still our beloved.
Right.
There's her cheek or something. I don't know. We'll just, Neshia, I'm so sorry. I've like, but you really did kind of like, it's such a beautiful winding of the warp and weft of life and death.
Yes.
So with that story though, can you tell me about how this has impacted the rest of your life and your story of what you do now?
Yeah, totally. I mean, my grandparents have shaped so much of who I am. Both my Samoan grandparents and my grandma Dorothy, my Black grandmother, who was also that person in her community who people lean to in times of grief and celebration. Her kitchen was the place, right, where everyone gathered. And, I had my own near-death experience when I was 5. And so I think all of my grandparents, all of my great aunts and great uncles, right, were always just really open about talking about death with me, about talking about loss with me. And so I think from a really young age, I just always was very aware of that. And I think there are terms that are used nowadays of like hypersensitive or, but I think that there are a lot of us since the beginning of time who, when elders notice that a young person has a certain affinity, right? They just start bringing them up in that way. So my first job out of college was at a hospice, a residential hospice in Washington, D.C. And it was my first time really seeing institutionalized death in the U.S. Coming from brown and Black communities, I've experienced lots of deaths that happen suddenly, where you don't get that chance to have this long process and these goodbyes, but there are these sudden deaths that really shake you and that really stay with you. And of having the opportunity, especially in Samoa, of getting to have those longer deaths and, where you get these really healing processes that are really steeped in tradition. But working in the hospice that I was working at as a 22-year-old and seeing, all of our residents is what we called our patients. All of them, for the most part, were Black men who were born and raised in DC, had never been on a plane, and were dying of things that I quickly realized should not kill people. Poverty, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to quality education across the spectrum, right? Not just in a schoolroom, but, lack of education around the fact that everyone is deserving of dignity and of respect and of safety. So, in the time that I was there for a year before I came back home to the West Coast. And while I was there, 17 people and 1 dog died. So it was this really intense, in a short period of time, learning all of the ways that systems can and will kill us if they don't see us as human. And all of the ways in which community in tender, fierce, consistent ways can show up for people and make a huge difference at the end of life.
Mm-hmm.
And, and for me, being around people watching people die, who looked like my uncles, who looked and sounded like my dad, right? With his Kentucky, draw that only comes out if he's tired, right? Like being around people who looked and felt like family activated and reminded me of all the ways that my grandparents had taught me of how you be with someone when they're living, when they're dying, when they're sick, when you love them and it's hard and you show up anyway, right? I think all of those lessons came to life, and that was when I fell in love with death work. I was like, I don't know what this is. I'm supposed to be here as like a little thing before I go to grad school and, do the plan. And I just loved it. I loved every minute of it. I loved being at the bedside. I loved going through advanced directives. I loved washing people's potties after they had died and, getting to do their hair and planning memorials and, watching as animals. We had cats and dogs at the hospice, and they were always the first to know, right? So well, learning to learn from our more than human friends.
So
I left. My family needed me to come back and support them. So I came back to the West Coast. I went back to life as scheduled. But always in the back of my mind, I was like, if I get a chance to, when I'm older and wiser, maybe it'll come back to me. Maybe I'll get to do this work again. And then last December, my grandfather died. My tama died, who really was the one who introduced me to death and kept bringing me back to death. And he died at 93 in Samoa, in our family home, surrounded by 4 generations of our family, in his bed, by his favorite. In Samoa, our traditional homes do not have walls. So he was in his favorite spot, right next to where he could see his favorite mango tree and, his favorite flowers that my grandmother had dyed and that my grandmother had planted, And when he died, I was not able to go home to Samoa. I had a 6-month-old at the time who didn't have a passport. But the day he died, my grandfather came and visited me. His spirit came and visited me, and we spent the whole day together, just holding hands and talking. And he told me he was tired, and we got to spend that time. And then I went to make dinner, and he died. He passed. And, once he passed, I realized, this is the person who maybe loved me most in the entire world, who believed in me, who was always so proud of me. And the time may never be perfect to just go and do death work, but the time is now anyway. Instead of waiting for someone to give me the opportunity, I need to just go do the work. Because we don't know how much time we have.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a quote from the Buddha that I really like of we always think that there's more time, right? The problem is we never know that we don't have as much time. And so I may live to be 93 like him. I hope I don't. That sounds like a lot of work. That sounds like a lot of time.
I agree with that. It's so funny. I'm like, ugh, doesn't want to be that long.
But, so I came back fully into death work in May. And my grandfather has just been so delighted. I feel his delight. And
beautiful.
So I kind of can't remember what you asked me, but I think I answered it.
Yes, you did. Beautifully. I have to say, I've been at the brink of tears several times during that during what you just told us, and just chills. Thank you so much for sharing such poignant thoughts and words and beauty of your life. So yeah, and actually the next kind of from there, and it would be a good segue into that, is tell us about what you're doing now, what your current
What is your death
role is.
work? How are
Yeah,
you a death worker?
Yeah. It doesn't quite look like what I thought it does, what I thought it would be. So I often call myself an end-of-life consultant, because I feel like what my death work looks like right now is gathering information that is readily available and is readily accessible, but so many people don't even know where to start. And kind of get flooded at just the thought of it, right? Like they know they should think ahead. They do want to think about their death, but they've had like no teaching around that. And so they just get anxious and overwhelmed. So a significant part of my work is working with like 20 somethings.
Oh, wow. Great.
Around end of life planning. There's something about people turning 25 and 30 and all of a sudden they're like, I need to think about my dying.
I'm mortal.
I'm mortal.
Midlife crisis.
Yes. So I end up doing a lot of like advanced planning at like birthday parties.
Beautiful.
So, these like 25-year-olds and 30-year-olds who I think they, I'm 34. I turned 35 in January, but they're like, she's young enough where like she's not gonna shame us. Like it's cool. And so they get together they get their like closest friends together, their chosen family together, and have me come in, and I bring advanced directives and like my whole end of life planning binder that I've put together. And we sit for a couple of hours and we just talk about everything. What's a healthcare agent? What's an advanced care directive? What's a pulse? What's final disposition? And I really want to be a tree. And I'm like, great. Have you heard of human composting? Right? We go through all these things. Where should you keep all your passwords? Right?
So great.
So
I love this as a birthday party theme. What a cool idea.
It's really fun.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely going to recommend you to all my friends. All my younger friends.
It's so fun because like they're with people who they've known for a long time, and yet they're surprising each other all the way through these conversations, right? Like, oh, that's something you really value. I didn't know that about you. Or, oh, I didn't know that that's really important to you. And I do not want that for myself, but I can honor that for you. And I can, like they're really cool conversations to have
intimate
with people.
Connection, right? Like this is your chosen family plus, we don't have those conversations often with people we assume are really our tight buddies.
Yeah, especially in that age group. So that's that's like the best ministry I've ever heard of.
I mean, I feel like they're ministering to me a lot through these. I feel really inspired and hopeful sitting with this younger generation, with my generation as well. And so that's a big part of my work that I'm really grateful for and wasn't expecting. And then I do what I think is like probably more classical death doula work of I often get called into a family by an adult grandchild who's around my age, but who tends to be like the emotional keeper of the family. And so I come in and I think in ideal situations, I get to be with the family for a while, before someone dies, and we get to know each other. They get to trust me, and I get to just show them what options are and really just be a presence. I think that's a huge part of our work is just, you all were talking about this in an episode. You know, there's the chaplain, there's the physicians, there's the palliative care nurse, there's the social worker, but there's not someone who's just there always bringing soup and, you know, like playing grandma's favorite songs and sitting with her and reading her favorite poetry and helping the family have these hard conversations and bringing out the photo albums. And, you know, so that's my job. I get to be that person, that other person, right? And I get to remind people that, yeah, you get to keep your person at home or at your aunt's house for a few days after they die, and like, let's sit vigil. Let's spend some time. Like in my family, in Samoan culture and in Black culture, one of the first things that we do when someone dies is sing, because there are no words, but there are these songs that we carry in our bodies, right? Negro spirituals and hymns and songs of lament, right? And so that's the first thing that often comes out, because we don't have words, but the grief needs to come out of our body. The grief and the celebration and, you know, like singing somebody home. And so I get to help families find their rituals. Like what's the first thing we need to do together as a collective to help you come into your body in this moment right after someone's breathed their last breath? Like, what do we need to do so that we can shatter safely together? And I'll hold for you, right? Like, I can give you ideas. Let's talk about, like, are there cultural traditions we can lean on? Are there cultural traditions we do not want to lean on in this moment? Are there like new things? And the dying person, right, gets to like lead us and teach us in that. So that's one part, you know, the actual death part. And then another big part of my work right now has just been like helping hold grief in community. So a lot of like nonprofits will call me if there's been a lot of death with their community organizers or with their team. And I come in and I do a grief event, whatever that looks like. So I've kind of become known locally as like the flower death doula. Because I often come in with, in my mind, I'm recreating my grandmother's garden, right? It's like a soothing practice for me. But when I show up with like buckets of flowers and I tell people, like, I've found that often people need to do something with their hands to keep from disassociating as they're working through grief. And so flowers are gentle on the hands. They smell nice. And so I have people make bouquets and I set out writing prompts, and I don't really give any other instruction. And I just see what comes up.
Wow.
And it's always really powerful, you know? So I get to create all these like really beautiful, fun, unique, really personalized grief events.
Beautiful. I think we need that like worldwide right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. I love that. I think this would probably be the quote that comes out of this, is shattering safely together.
Yeah.
I just love that.
I put a little clip on there. Yeah. I have that down too. Beautiful.
Perfect way of saying it. Thank you.
Yeah. So what are your challenges in the work that you do?
Yeah. A big challenge that I've come across is just how afraid people are of admitting we're all going to die and having the conversations. Oftentimes there's this leaning in and this leaning away. They're like, wow, people hear what I do and they meet me and they're like, I really wish, you know, you had been there for my family during this. But then when the time comes when someone is dying, right? Or if I'm like, well, we can still do this or this, right? there's this leaning away because suddenly that makes it too real, right?
Yeah.
So that's been a really interesting challenge of in a culture and a society that's really afraid of death. How do we even get close to it then? So that's something that I'm finding my way through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what have you found that helps you feel supported in your day-to-day work, helps you feel like you've got, what do you fall back to when you are overwhelmed yourself?
Yeah. The first the first people I think of are my children. I have an 18-month-old son and a 4-year-old this Friday, who my grandfather named after my grandmother. And, with all the challenges of parenting small humans and, there is this joy and this hope that comes of having them. And I feel like I'm someone, because of the work I do and because of who I am, I'm constantly grieving. And I get to model for my children how to, I think of my grief like making a cake. It's not something that is separate from the other parts of my life, from the whole, but it's something that I'm like constantly stirring into the batter with really light touches to keep, you want to be as gentle with it as possible, right? Like mixing the egg whites in. You don't want to beat any of the fluffiness out. You don't want to beat any of the lightness out, but it has to get incorporated all the way through.
Wow, yeah.
In order to create something really tasty and soothing for the soul. So I think of grief like that, and my children help me learn how to do that, right? I come home from a bedside and from a really challenging situation. And even at the bedside, right, I reach into my pocket to pull out lavender for the person who's dying. And instead, I pull out rocks and pine cones and snacks and, right? And that reminder of life, there's so much life happening, even as death is happening, right?
Yeah.
There's so much joy, even in these little moments. And and whenever I can, I bring my children with me into my work, right? They'll come to grief events. They'll come to the bedside if that's appropriate and if the family wants that. And I get to see this other generation, like how they embody grief, or even the curiosity that they have around death, and, the deep knowing that they have around big feelings.
Yeah.
In little words.
In little words. Yeah. Wow. Lovely. Thank you.
So, what frightens you about the end of life?
Oh, yes. What frightens me? I think in this moment, what frightens me, and I was thinking about this question, I don't think it's necessarily fear, but I think I hold on to it so tight because it's precious that then it feels like fear of missing it. I'm scared of like not getting to see my kids step into the fullness of who they are, right?
Yeah.
I'm scared of like, is there something I'm missing? Like, is there something I'm supposed to do before it's my time? And am I going to miss it?
Right. Yeah.
I'm trying to live authentically. I'm trying to live in a way that does good to the world. And so I have that fear of like, is there a teaching I need to know as an ancestor that I'm going to miss because I am so busy, like trying to do things right or trying to make things perfect or try, so
trying to
that's
do things.
right. Just trying to like get out the door in the morning.
Yeah, I hear you.
Right.
Am I going to miss like the really important lessons of my life because I'm so busy trying to like, because I'm just so busy.
Well,
Right.
you're a human being,
Right.
it is a lot of work to be a human.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. I love that. This has been so fun so far. So really, we've kind of covered everything. I think, is there anything you wish we had asked you?
Oh, I don't know what the question is, but the thing that is rising is just wanting to make sure, oftentimes I get asked, like, how could you do this kind of work? Like, oh, like what? It's so hard, it's
Aren't
so
you
heavy.
depressed?
Yes,
Right?
yes, those questions.
Right.
And, my death work is really first and foremost like grounded in celebration
Mm-hmm.
and in deep love. Like this is something that I come from a long lineage of people who have done this
Yeah.
in different
Yeah.
ways. And
Yeah.
at some point we're all going to do this if we're
That's true.
if we're in community, right? If we're taking care of people and loving people in any capacity, then this is the
Yes.
work we end up doing.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
if we
true.
don't end up doing that work, it's because something really important is missed and lost
True.
in my mind.
Yeah.
And so, like I really celebrate getting to be able to do this. Like I feel all my ancestors who also did this work, who like gave their lives in order to do this work, who really built up communities doing this. And this comes from a deep place of love and lineage and celebration and of knowing that I'm just one in a long line, right? There's everyone who came before me and there's everyone who's coming after me, and we're all doing this work together.
Yeah. Yeah.
So whatever the question was that would have led to that answer.
That's a perfect. I love it. I love it. Yeah. Talking about the caravan.
Yeah.
The
the
Sufis call it a
caravan.
caravan, right? The caravan, they're behind us and in front of us. Yeah.
All around us. And
Yeah. All around us. Yes. Thank you. That's such a beautiful answer to whatever question it was.
Love question.
Yeah. To the question of how do you love? Really, it just, again, this whole interview, I've just been.
Yes.
Just
I have lots
feeling
of hearts on my notes.
I know.
Yay.
Yeah. So it's been such a pleasure. And we will keep in touch.
Thanks so much for joining us on the End of Life Conversations. We appreciate you and look forward to sharing our stories. We encourage you to subscribe to have access to premium episodes and extra resources. Links to our guests and their recommendations and a transcript of this episode will be in the podcast notes.
Yes, thank you so much. And please tell all your friends. Follow us on social media, and again, consider subscribing for some excellent premium content. We want to acknowledge that the music we are using was composed and produced by Charles Heastand. We also want to acknowledge that we live on unceded lands that have been cared for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples who are still here.